Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. Kāwika Tengan. He is a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa with joint appointments in the departments of ethnic studies and anthropology. He is a native Hawaiian scholar whose work is deeply rooted in indigenous knowledge systems with the focus on Hawaiian culture, identity, and masculinity. Tengan's interdisciplinary research blends anthropology, cultural studies, and indigenous methodologies to explore the complexities of Hawaiian identity and the impact of colonialism on indigenous communities. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Mahalo. Thank you so much for this invitation to talk story.
Of course. I almost made it through the entire bio without making a mistake. I was so excited and then I slipped up. It's been an ongoing challenge to see when I can get through the whole thing without a single slip up. Reading out loud is hard.
I know, and I missed that one little bit myself because I've only been a full professor for a couple of years myself, so I still think I'm an associate and say, wait, oh no, wait, I got to change that.
Nice. I'm really excited for calling today. You're calling out of Hawaii. In how has it been? We talked a little bit about the weather, but how is everything else going?
Yeah, Hawaii is the temperature is great now, but as is unfortunately more frequent than not, in the summers, we are sort of in drought conditions again, and that is what led to the massive wildfires that we've just marked the sad anniversary of on Maui last August 8th, where the town of Lahaina and 102 people were lost to fires that were um, far from just natural. These were fires that happened because of the dewatering of the island due to industrial capitalism and then conditions exacerbated by climate change. So we've had a bunch of other wildfires even since then. Again, I mean, none to the extent that happened last year, but it's always a possibility that another is coming. And so we are again kind of watching for what's going to happen next with those situations and really struggling to restore the flow of our streams that would help to protect us against those fires, but also reconnect us to older ways of being on the land that are more sustainable, but also more abundant.
Hmm. I think one thing that I've learned a lot just from this season is this word indigenous is actually so much more diverse than often it's given credit for. I mean, I've spoken to people from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada, from the States, and now, also reaching out to people in Hawaii. I feel like it's fascinating to kind of understand how diverse indigeneity can be. And I think to kind of put it into context, it's important to also always start with history to understand, how did we get to where we are today? And so I thought perhaps a place that we could start this conversation with is the history of some of the indigenous people in Hawaii to kind of understand, what happened, what transpired, and how do we get to today? So if you had to pick like a pivotal starting point, because you could always go back 10,000 years or however long, where would you start?
A pivotal starting point. Well, within the Hawaiian community, the starting point is always at the very beginning. And we have over 2,000 line cosmogonic genealogical chant that was recorded in the 19th century, but authored by multiple people just generations over generations ago. And this chant that tells of the creation of the world and the genealogical lines that connect us to that origin of the universe is called the Kumulipo. And the Kumulipo is where we start, and it's telling of this emergence from the darkness, from the night that connects us today to the primal elemental forms, to the deities and gods, to all of the plants and animals, to the chiefs, and then to the people. And so that text, as I had pointed to, was recorded by King Kalakaua in the, I believe, 1880s, and was meant to remind us what our origins are, despite any other sorts of theorizations of when the first Polynesians arrived in the islands and what chronologies are discussed in Western contexts. Our own point of regrounding ourselves in our own history, our own cosmology, our own aina, our own lands, is through that chant, the Kumulipo. So I think it's an important one to start with because the Kumulipo in all of this kind of capaciousness helps to also tell us where we're going. It helps us to find a framework for understanding the events that are happening now in this much longer history that includes, in some ways, the arrival of the first Polynesian voyagers who came to these islands. That again, these are chronologies that move all back and forth. Maybe somewhere around 080, maybe 300, maybe 1100, whatever that Gregorian calendar marking is. For us, we know that we had ancestors who came from this far off land called Kahiki, who came to these islands, developed the society that became our traditional society, even though tradition is always moving, it's always changing, um, and was a robust uh, set of island societies that had high-ranking ali'i chiefs that were seen as the closest descendants of the gods, um, and the vast population of people were farmers and fishers called maka'ainana, those uh, who were living on the land and stewarding it. And that was the society that put into place really important ecological and cultural systems, much of which was centered around watersheds and the kind of flowing of waters in the ahupua'a, these divisions of land that were allowing for the flow of waters from the mountain to the ocean that fed the taro patches, the lo'ikalo, and also enabled quite a lot of other cultural development. So that is my as close as I can get
Mhm.
to the nutshell version of where
Yeah.
I would start with our ancient past.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot that I still have to learn, so please don't take me wrong. I'm just curious. So the language that you're speaking, what would that be called? There were a few words in there that you spoke in a different language. What language is that?
Right. So I mean Hawaiian, but the Hawaiian for Hawaiian would be Olelo Hawaii.
Hmm. Write that down. Yeah, I mean it's a yeah. It's so
And
in
you know,
yeah.
I use it intentionally because part of our own resurgence, our reclaiming of identity, of culture, of sovereignty is by speaking those words again and making refamiliarizing ourselves and other listeners with the sounds of our ancestral tongue that was at least for a time, prohibited in our schools and in our families and our communities, as is a case with many other indigenous peoples. And looking ahead to, I think, some of your other questions you had for me, part of the decolonizing education is to, again, re ground ourselves in those concepts and those ideas that are embedded in our language. Though I realize for this podcast, I'm going to try to pull back on too much Hawaiian, but there are certain terms that will matter more, and I'll try to focus on some of
Yeah.
those a little bit more.
And I think sometimes the largest terrible the disservice that happens when we kind of are forced to always translate things that we experience or feel in a certain language into another is there are things that just cannot be translated, and it misses perhaps the context in which it is said when it's spoken in its original tongue. I think, we've recently been reading this Dostoevsky book, and so much of me is I just wish I could understand Russian, because I'm like, I wonder how much meaning is being missed from this translation that's being done here. And I'm curious. I want to ask you this particular question because we were talking about language. So my parents and they grew up, they are Tamil, which is a language from South India. And I can't speak it all too well. And I feel like growing up, something that I had always felt was, why? I mean, I live in the US. I barely speak it to anyone here. Why don't I just speak English? And there is something that's very unique about that place where people love that their language. Like, I mean, it is something that Tamil people stand very strongly behind, and it's a deep love for their language. And there's something to be said about they don't want their language to ever die. And I feel like as I get older, I'm realizing some of the importance on that. But I'd love to hear from you, maybe expanding on why it's important to keep someone's language alive. Like, what do you think is kind of the sentiment behind that?
Right. I mean, it's not only the way that we communicate with each other in our own tongue, it's also the way that we speak back to our ancestors and that they can speak forward to us and so forth onto our descendants. There's something critical about carrying on these languages that are able to survive even in transformed ways. The massive transformations and changes of time, especially the colonial and um, post-colonial and settler colonial times. And so that's one of those things that also opens up these alternatives to these kind of colonial presents. Right? I think if we're looking for ways of being otherwise, quite a lot of that is found in the language. And for one example, and if I'm going to kind of circle back to a certain term, maybe it'll be this concept of wai, W-A-I, which in Hawaiian is water. That's one level of meaning, fresh water in particular, as opposed to salt water or ocean water. Some people also see that as part of what defines Hawaii, which again is in the middle of the term Hawaii. Uh, it's again this central core aspect of life, and there is a whole complex cultural, ideological, political, and economic system all around Hawaii, all around water. If we're gonna think against capitalism and the sorts of manufactured scarcities that come from that economic system in order to create wealth, right? Why and water and its circulation offers another model that, in fact, the Hawaiian term for wealth traditionally was wai. It's a reduplication of the term wai of water, which is to point to the fact that in the old days, those who were wealthy, quote unquote, were those um, who had an abundance of water in their lands, which was never an individual kind of wealth. It was always a collective wealth and cultural wealth that enabled populations to grow kalo and the many other crops that were being grown at the time that allowed for the estuaries that where the freshwater met salt waters to be rich with life in order to help spawn fish and also made we also had these fish ponds that were erected to be full of the fish. Um, so wealth was understood in terms of water. And I know you and I were talking a little bit about policy issues and some problems about not being able to see past certain policies or laws. The term for law um, in Hawaiian is Kānawai, which is also grounding it in water and the proper management of it, right? And that becomes a central policy set of laws, set of restrictions, really, that also enable a thriving community in Hawaii. There's more I could say on that, but if we're looking again to think outside of the policy, legal, economic frameworks that we're stuck in, at least in Hawaiian, when we look to our language, we know that everything is pointing back to water. And there's something
Hmm.
really critical to think through there.
I mean, it's fascinating how grammar, I mean, whether the verb goes before the subject, small things like that can actually really sh shape the way you actually think. I know there's an example we had a linguist on, and there was an example where I forgot it. I think it was in German, but it was this example of how you don't say I am doing, you don't say you are doing something like but you are that. Like you are a person of that. So if you're running, it's not like you are running, like you runner. Like it's a different
Hmm.
shift where whenever you're doing an action, you become the action, not simply you're not still a being who does the action. But that simple change completely changes your relationship with what it means to do something rather than being like, I am Gautam and I'm going to go on a run. It's like, oh, I am Gautam, the runner when I run. I mean, it's fascinating how each language offers something so powerful and beautiful like that. And losing that, I think, over time is a disservice to not just the people, but to humanity as a whole, I think, because you lose a lot of that knowledge. So one question I want to kind of get into colonialism and talk a little bit about how that impacted education and also knowledge and people's way of life. So Hawaii, if I'm right, was colonized near the end of the 1700s. Is that correct? Early 1800s.
Um, Not quite.
My history's off.
So the first foreign in terms of European foreign, because we had other foreigners before that, but the first European foreigners who came and really essentially led to the staying of Europeans was James Cook and his ship, so 1778. Although
Yes.
there are some other records of perhaps other Spanish ships arriving and maybe some from Japan. And then we have a longer history where inter-island voyaging between Hawaii and other Polynesian islands continued even into the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. And there was a marking of Hawaiians, or at the time it wasn't Hawaii, because Hawaii only comes about with the unification of the islands, but people indigenous to here from versus other parts of the Pacific. But moving back to Cook, who is the one that essentially brings imperialism to the islands. Um, that's 1778. I'm going to do some real fast glossing here. Um, at that time, the islands there was a lot of warring going on between the chiefs of different islands. There were chiefdoms essentially set up. That there was a main kind of chiefdom of Hawaii Island. There was one of Maui that included Lanai and parts of Molokai. There was one of Oahu that also had parts of Molokai. And then Kauai and Niihau had their own kind of high chief. So there was essentially four major kind of chiefdoms vying for power, but they were all somehow related through intermarriage, and so there were other options besides war to bring the islands together. Um, that's the context that Cook and the later Europeans who followed, first the other explorers, then traders, entered into, and were also, in a sense, recruited into internal kind of indigenous dynamics, seeking power internally. The end result of all of that was that Kamehameha, Hawaii island chief, uh, conquered all the other islands except for Kauai and Niihau, and they finally, the king there finally yielded authority to Kamehameha in 1810. So 1810 is essentially when you have the formation of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which is then recognized internationally in 1843 through the efforts of Kamehameha's son, um, who he had two sons that succeeded him. The first one tragically kind of passed away in England when he was there. The second one, who was Kamehameha the Third, had the longest reign, essentially did the reforming of the kingdom as a constitutional monarchy and was able to earn a kind of international recognition. So Hawaii was its own kingdom, not colonized, certainly influenced by imperialism very much. By this time, also by a very large American missionary presence, as missionaries became involved not only as advisors to the king and the chiefs, but importantly, their successors, their children and grandchildren, very much a part of the emergence of the plantation economy in the kingdom. Nevertheless, it was a kingdom ruled by our kings and queen at the end, and a legislature as well. They had a House of Nobles and House of Representatives. Um, and I'm trying not to go too much into the nitty-gritty details. Um,
No, we love the nitty-gritty.
America always had an interest, and it grew even more um, with the focus on Pu'uloa, which came to be known as Pearl Harbor, as a coaling station for its navy, as the U.S. had its eyes on getting to Asia. And that was kind of always America's interest was in the basing of its kind of emerging empire here, um, as well as the fact that most of the businessmen that became really involved in the kingdom's economy were American, formerly American. Many of them kind of became citizens of the kingdom, although I think they always saw themselves as American. And there were some other foreign businessmen as well, but mainly Americans. And all of those interests kind of came together at the end of the 19th century when Queen Liliuokalani, our last reigning monarch, um, was seeking to really undo some of the transformations in the kingdom that had disempowered both Native Hawaiians as well as non-white immigrants. Long history there, but in any case, there was a constitution that was forced upon her brother, uh, her predecessor, that stripped him of power and put really the power in the hands of the white planters. Um, so she was trying to undo that. The planters called in the U.S. military to land its troops to quote unquote protect them from this tyrannical, crazy native woman. Um, and they did. The U.S. Minister Stevens landed the Marines January 1893, orchestrated the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Um, January 17th is that date. Our queen, Liliuokalani, yielded her authority until such time as it would be restored. This wasn't the first time our Hawaiian kingdom had seen something like this. Back in 1843. There was a kind of rogue British captain who did something kind of similar, and at the time, the British Crown did restore Hawaiian sovereignty. With that precedent, our queen assumed the same would happen in 1893. That did not happen, unfortunately. And instead, there was a period between 1893 and 1898 where there was very strong resistance to um, those who were trying to really undo the sovereignty of our Hawaiian kingdom and make us American, which, despite really massive protests that were in the forms of petitions, at least once where arms are taken up, um, this illegal annexation did happen in 1898. And it was after that that Hawaii became an American territory. And it kind of stayed a territory until 1959 when it became a state, although most of us who are looking at its history call it fake statehood because there was another set of violations of international norms and laws in the plebiscite that was held to vote. Nevertheless, that's how Hawaii as the quote unquote 50th state comes into being. Um, and it is it is a state now really dominated economically and politically by tourism and militarism, and always to the detriment of our people, both our indigenous as well as other longtime local families were forced to move out at ever increasing rates. We now have more Native Hawaiians outside of Hawaii than in Hawaii, and those trends look like they're only accelerating.
Hmm. One, thank you for anytime someone is given the task of laying out the history. That's a very arduous task, but I appreciate you for doing a great job and also trying. It's always hard, and it's hard to know which pieces to include, which pieces not to include, because there's so much that play a big role that simplifying it down always makes it very difficult. But I think it's so
I
important to
would
start.
also note that for the popular audiences that want to find the kind of really condensed but pretty good version, the John Oliver piece that was just done last week, or just this past Sunday, on last week tonight. I think that's what it's called on Max. He had
Great
a
show.
20-minute segment that was a really, really actually nice condensation of all this history. And again, it was on this anniversary of the August 8th fires. I think that's what prompted that special segment. But there's a nice kind of run through, and I watched it, and it was pretty legit in terms of the way that he did it. So there's that.
Cool. Okay, yeah, I will definitely watch that and link that as well. The John Oliver segment. I love John Oliver, by the way. I think he just does really good journalism a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah. And that piece is a really good one for people who want to have more than the whatever it was I did,
Yeah.
8-minute version.
Yeah, 8 to 20. Um, but I think I want to talk a little bit about, we spoke earlier, the last episode with someone from Canada who talked a little bit about how colonialism changed the mindsets of the people who were occupied. I'm really curious to kind of highlight and speak a little bit more about how the colonial kind of history changed what people were being taught, how people thought of themselves, how they thought about themselves in relation to being American in that span from before they hit statehood in 1959 all the way to the early 1800s, like after they became a kingdom and after they were recognized internationally and when they were, yeah. So between that time, how do you feel like colonialism kind of impacted the feelings and sentiments of people in Hawaiians then?
Yeah, another big question with a lot of different answers. I would just say I'll give one answer, but there are many answers to that. Certainly, there was even during the period of the Hawaiian Kingdom when it was our own chiefs who were ruling and kings and our queen, um, because largely because I think of the the ways in which our ancestors had to present itself as a modern nation state, right, in order to secure and then protect Hawaiian sovereignty. There was an effort to take on those institutions, religious, political, economic, that were seen as modern, and that was always cast against, right, the pre-modern, the primitive, right, and so um, ancestral practices that had sustained our people and lands for generations were deemed as backwards, right, savage, and at the same time, all of those new institutions were seen as necessary. So that came to be what our ancestors took up, literacy and the Bible really more as an avenue towards literacy. Um, and I think there's never a kind of black and white kind of before and after, right? There was never a pure kind of pre-colonial culture to begin with. It was always changing. And with that in mind, the changes that happened during the kingdom, where all of these new institutions are taken on, are at the same time new, but also Hawaiianized, right? Made to serve our own ancestors' needs. So laws, yeah, Western laws are taken on, but they're also aligning with Hawaiian concepts. The Bible and the religion is also brought in, but it also, in a way, helps to ground our community in what we always found was important, a kind of deep spirituality. Maybe it's transformed now. Um, and the literacy, I think, is really important if we're going to get to education. I mean, the Hawaiians by the droves flocked to the missions mainly in order to be educated in literacy so that really they could sustain themselves as a modern literate nation. This is one of the biggest accomplishments of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Kamehameha III, who I had mentioned earlier, had this saying, Hail Puni Pala Pala Ko'u. Mine will be a kingdom of learning, of education. And very quickly, Hawaii became one of the most, if not the most, literate nations in the world, because so many people went to the schools and took up education, were writing down their old stories, even if they were saying they're all backwards and pagan. At the same time, they were writing them all down, right? And the the breadth of the archive and depth of it is really unparalleled in terms of other indigenous nations. Something like in the Hawaiian language newspapers, which started running from the 1830s, I believe, up until the 1940s, over 1 million pages today, if you were to kind of take them all out. It's a critical source of ancestral knowledge that, again, happened to have occurred because of those transformations in education and that the really lifting up of it, even as some of these stories were being shared as examples of the heathen and pagan past, but there's still a lot of details in there, a lot of old chants, a lot of old gods still living in the language. Again, back to the language, why it's so important, because it was only after the overthrow of our queen during this kind of tumultuous period where kind of the insurrectionists had taken over control of the kingdom and declared themselves a republic, it was only during that time that there was a law passed that banned Hawaiian as a medium for instruction in our schools.
Hmm.
That, along with again the loss of sovereignty and control of our lands more generally, was really one of those key moments that severed us from that ancestral archive that was recorded by people taking up the tools of modernity in order to make sure that that knowledge could get passed on. It wasn't until really the revival and revitalization of Hawaiian language from the 1970s onward, um, that a new generation was able to go back to those archives and to reimagine education now in the kind of decolonial mode as grounded in our own ancestors' engagement with education, with literacy, but to also use it as a way of connecting us across time and space.
Hmm. I'm curious. We had a season on Puerto Rico, and it was really interesting to kind of hear the mixed perspectives on how people felt about being a territory versus wanting statehood versus many people wanting themselves to be their own nation, how they felt about it. And before we get into decolonization and understanding what part of that plays a role, I'm really curious to understand throughout the years, starting from when statehood in 1959 happened, what was kind of the sentiment towards the United States as a whole, and where do you think that's at today?
Well, first off, going back to that moment of the annexation, um, again, at that point in time, 1897, 1898, when the US was considering a annexation bill that was offered again by the tree by the traitors who had betrayed our queen and then taken control of our kingdom. They're the ones who submitted this treaty for annexation. The white sugar planters, the children and grandchildren of the missionaries. Um, at that time, Hawaiians organized en masse, collected in two organizations. They collected over 38,000 signatures from a population of around 40,000. There was one signature, one petition against annexation. There was about 17,000, another one that was 21,000. Some of those names are overlapping to be sure, but still, the just even if you look at one of those by itself, the 21,000 monster petition, um, that's just again by far the majority of the kingdom's populace that was against annexation. And these treaties were submitted to Congress and helped to actually kill that bill, that treaty of annexation. Um, then the Spanish American War kind of occurs, and McKinley just kind of says, "Oh, let's make this happen." Uh, a Newlands resolution is submitted, which is not a treaty, but this becomes the way that U.S. claims Hawaii, despite all the other legal forms, because all the other legal forms of annexation had failed. This is what is used because, at least in international law, internal resolutions don't have international force, but this one did. So
Mm.
there was that memory amongst the populace during the territorial period. Um, but there was also people who found that, they saw this coming and they wanted to try to have more agency in a territory and vote. Um, and so when this happened, when Hawaii became a territory of the U.S., um, and it was annexed 1898, it was organized as a territory in 1900 and had its first kinds of elections there. Um, there was a Native Hawaiian Party that was established that actually, for the first decade of the 20th century, um, was the most important political party. Um, but the big but about governance of the territory um, is that the governor was appointed by the U.S. They
Hmm.
the local people couldn't vote on their governor. They could vote on their territorial legislature members, but not the governor. And the governor always had veto power. So even though there was this really important Hawaiian party, the Home Rule Party is what it was called, everything that they tried passing for the betterment of Hawaiians got vetoed. And it was primarily Republican governors. And so in that first decade of the 20th century, in the 1900s, there then was a slow shift towards Hawaiians forming an alliance with the Republican Party in order so that they could actually have some kind of say in the governance of the territory. Um, Territory from 1900 through 1959 was run like a big sugar plantation. There were five major corporations, they call them the Big Five now, that really ran everything. Um, there was an alliance with the Hawaiian chiefs, or formerly recognized as the chiefs, um, and there was a very high number of families that had come as immigrants to work on the plantations. Um, China, Japan, Portugal, Philippines, Korea, Okinawa, Puerto Rico included after 1898. Um, and so it was a multi-ethnic population. Hawaiians still had a lot of political power, but that started to diminish as their own numbers continued to drop because of a long history of epidemics. Um, though they still had a lot of clout, but again, the fact that the appointed governor of the territory always was going to hamstring any efforts of full kind of autonomy on the part of Hawaiians led to this very clear knowledge that as a territory, um, there's only so much that we can do.
Mm,
Um, the war transformed a lot of things. Um, it empowered, especially a second generation, second and third, but mainly second generation of Japanese um, residents who had either served in the kind of famed 442nd Regiment, the All Japanese Regiment. It started off as the 100th Battalion, then became the 442nd, that became very famous, um, along with other labor organizers. That led to when they came back from the war and were both the returning veterans and the labor organizers, when they had really set up the conditions for the territorial elections, which saw the rise of the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, and it's called the kind of Democratic Revolution, 1954. Um, that helped to kind of change a lot of the ways in which the territory was being run, um, and also led for them and those in the Democratic Party to really have a strong push for statehood, which again, there is a lot of procedures that were violated in terms of the way the plebiscite was held. Hawaii should have been listed on the list of non-self-governing territories up for decolonization. US kind of unilaterally pulled it off that list, so decolonization was not an option you could vote for in this plebiscite. It also led all of its military vote, so that was also not in accordance with international law. Um, so the vote was rigged from the beginning. But back to this point about the sentiment of what it was to be in the territory, the Hawaiians knew that even though most didn't want to be American, they knew that that second class citizenship status as a subject of the territory was one that um, needed to be overcome. So there's a lot of different kind of takes on that, but um, statehood happened, fake statehood, as we like to say, but it happened, 1959. And it actually only just saw really the further and much more rapid decline of the status of Hawaiians after that point, um, due to the transformations in land laws, the rise of mass tourism, the major developments that started to replace the plantations, the loss of political power of Hawaiians. Um, And all of that decline really is what led to the resurgence that we're in now of Hawaiians organizing to protect lands, to regain sovereignty, language, and education. Education, a key part of that movement.
Hmm. I mean, I think that's one of the most interesting things about tourism and how destructive it can be. Because I don't know. I mean, even growing up, it was always like, let's go to Hawaii. That seemed to, and it wasn't with no understanding of kind of the history or the challenges that people there can be facing due to tourism. And also, there obviously are benefits as well. But, same with Puerto Rico. It was fascinating to me when I was there to see how many people were so like kind of mindless of all the pain that the tourism was also causing, and it wasn't just all kind of merry. And so I'm curious, in your perspective, what do you think is kind of the current sentiment, especially surrounding this like massive tourism, which does uplift a lot of the economy, but it seems like other aspects of the economy was shut down so that tourism could rise, and then now you're kind of like, yeah, I'm curious what your opinion is on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there have been a number of different polls taken that have shown the majority of Hawaii feels like the state is being run for tourism rather than for local people. Um, every every time one looks for information about migration, it's usually a story of out-migration of Native Hawaiian and local families who can no longer afford to be here because real estate is so high because of tourism-focused development. And also the longtime tourists of the billionaires who come in, set up shop here, and buy up a whole bunch of land, and in some cases, almost an entire island. Um, so it's widespread that there is not a lot of patience for tourism and tourists, and it's not even individual, but it's just the ways in which the industry has ruled the islands. And um, as you say, I mean, it's not a diversified economy. We should be growing more of our own food. We should be doing quite a lot more to help us engage in other ways in the world, but it's a whole bunch of jobs, serving tourists in hotels and restaurants instead. Um, and then the ecological impacts are again is what was also most clearly seen in the fires last August. All that water that should be flowing naturally into the streams in Lahaina that in the in the 18th century was noted as a rich oasis and called the Venice of the Pacific. All of those were diverted in the 19th century, in the kind of 1870s, especially onward, for the plantations. Those companies that phased out of the plantation business became developers and kept the water for the hotels and the golf courses and the kind of gated communities where it's all green there in Lahaina, and then everywhere else is brown. And so this is again one of the clearest examples of the real dire consequences of putting our resources, our water especially, um, into places that it doesn't need to be. And
Hmm.
this is again with the travesty of the fires and the deaths that happened in Lahaina. There's now been a kind of a new reckoning with the state of our economy and how much of it is focused on tourism to the detriment of our own people and our lands. And so there is maybe a new opportunity. There recently was finally a, a set of bills that were passed both at the state and at the county level to phase out the short-term vacation rentals, all the Airbnbs that are owned by people primarily not from Hawaii who come to buy up most of the housing in order just to rent it out to tourists, leaving a shortage of housing for our local families. And at this point, because of the fires where, so many of them have lost their homes, the only way to actually rehouse them is to start phasing out those vacation rentals. So that's an important move that unfortunately required the devastation of Lahaina to happen. It's still not complete. There's still a lot of pushback against it, but it's just one of these examples. The big fight is still around the water, is restoring the water to the places that it used to flow naturally in Lahaina, and not only there, but really across the islands. That example of Lahaina is really about all of our islands.
Hmm. The why.
Yep, the way.
Um, I was going to ask you, so, you talked a little bit about decolonization. I wanted to kind of talk about that in relation to education. We touched on language and the importance of reclaiming language. I wanted to talk about some of the other ways in which decolonizing through education looks like. What have you seen, and what are some of the efforts that maybe you've also been a part of?
Sure. Well, for me, and I'll kind of haven't quoted a whole bunch of my colleagues, even though I've been thinking with their work a lot. But my colleague Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, who's a political scientist and an educator, wrote a really important and powerful book, which I always like to use. The book is called "The Seeds We Planted," and it's about a Native Hawaiian charter school that she and others helped to establish. Um, that was created essentially to address the failings of the public school system with respect to Native Hawaiians. Um, and so, as an alternative way of educating our youth, this school called Halau Kumana, as well as a number of other Native Hawaiian charter schools, were established. Um, and really, the idea is to ground them in the land, in the relationships to the land, to the waters, and to each other as a form of not only reclaiming education, but of decolonizing our thinking, our relationships, our economic systems. And so she goes into some nice ethnographic detail, and it is an ethnography um, about the rebuilding and maintenance of the Lo'ikalu, which is the irrigated taro fields that traditionally were the primary source um, of our starch in Hawaii. And the taro or the kalo in Hawaiian, we have this deep genealogical connection to, back to the Kumulipo. I'll point back there since that's where we started. Um, that sees the kalo as the elder sibling of the Hawaiian people. And every time we replant it and we eat it in the form of poi is the more well-known form that the taro is prepared as, but in other forms, we have this deep reconnection with our ancestors and with our land. But it's also the growing of it that has really been important in a lot of the land and water-based movements to restore our ecosystems. And it requires fresh flowing water to go into these terraces that then get returned back into the streams. So it's also this important example of a circular economy, which has been something my colleague Kamana Beamer has been talking quite a lot about. Um, so this happens at the kind of micro level of clearing out, overgrown fields that once in the past were growing kalo and clearing out the irrigation what do you call them? The Hawai, which are the traditional irrigational, oh, what's the word now? Things,
Mhm.
places that run water. Blanking on the word now. Um, the but clearing all of those out so that
Mm.
the water can flow again. Um, and she makes this argument that that's what education needs to do. It needs to clear these Hawai. It needs to clear these pathways so that water can flow again,
Mm.
both physically, but also intellectually, spiritually, and that's the best kind of decolonial education. And it's something that we've seen here at the university work as well, both in the restoration of Lo'i here on campus, but also in rethinking the purpose of education of our courses as opening up the flow of knowledge between ourselves and our ancestors and the land. And quite a lot of that needs to happen in that kind of grounded, embodied experience on the land and in the water, but it's not restricted to that. And that becomes the kind of way that we know what it is that we're seeking by being in the lo'i, by helping to clear out the away. Um,
Mm.
but it also helps to serve as a model. And for me, that's something I've taken inspiration from in my classes, both in ethnic studies and anthropology, where we have a lo'i on campus. I'll take my students to so they can get that experience, but then I'll also ask them to think through what it means to open up these channels, these ways of allowing flows of knowledge to happen, whether it's in the archives and returning to those again, those old archives in the Hawaiian language newspapers that perhaps have been just waiting for someone to reconnect it so that that knowledge can come back to us, and then using that as a basis for creating theory, for creating method. There's lots of examples offered by my colleagues, especially Noi Silva, who's also in political science, who's done quite a lot of this work on the petitions I was talking about earlier, on both 19th and 20th century Native Hawaiian intellectuals who were thinking genealogically, um, and other ways, and always putting these kinds of texts that people I'm referencing before the students so that they're also reading our own contemporary as well as older intellectuals, and knowing that we have this basis of knowledge from which we can kind of grow and thrive and build upon.
Hmm. I wanted to
Irrigation,
ask,
irrigation ditches was the word I was looking for.
ditches?
These ditch, the
Nice.
irrigation ditches are the awai, that were man-made kind of
Yes.
ditches that would redirect water. But our ditches, our awai, put the water back in the stream. The plantation ditches just took the water, and they did not
Hmm.
return them to the streams. And I think that's why I was having the block on ditch
Yeah.
because well, these days, when people talk about ditches, they're talking about the ones built by the plantations, which don't
Hmm.
return the water. And again, the language issue. I mean, this is maybe the great example of the language. Like Hawaii is about the currents of water. That's what Hawaii is, water currents, and knowing that those currents need to return the ditch in English
Hmm.
is just this other thing that again, from the experience of the plantations, is really taking it out of the streams, putting it in fields that don't return the water. And I think there's something, again, back to your earlier question on language and what's the difference. I mean, like, I have a hard time thinking about Hawaii as ditches, but that was the English word I was kind of grasping for. It's an irrigation ditch, but it's a very different kind of channel that's created when it's an away versus a ditch.
Mhm. You said something that I wanted to touch on, and I kind of wish I touched on it earlier, but because I have I have a hunch that perhaps when you say the word ancestors, I'm thinking about something maybe slightly different than what maybe you're talking about. When you say this word ancestors, I wanted to clarify a little more. Is that just people in our family, or are those people who, yeah, who are ancestors?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm talking really broadly about, yeah, starting with our own family, those grandparents and great grandparents we can name in our genealogy, but more broadly, the collective of Hawaiians who came before us, all of those folks who were writing in the newspapers. But more broadly than that, again, not only the generations that were writing, but those that go back all the way to the beginning of time in the Kumulipo. That's why Kumulipo is so important. Um, Another colleague of mine, Lili Kala Kame'elehiva in Hawaiian Studies, writes about the Kumulipo and how its essential lesson is that we're all related, and all of not only we in terms of people, but also the lands that we're related to. And again, back to the point about Kalo as an ancestor, right? In the Hawaiian Kumulipo, in other stories, it's the Sky Father Wakea, um, Earth Mother, Papa, who give birth to the islands. They also give birth to a girl who Wakea sleeps with. Their firstborn is stillborn and planted or buried. It's the same word in Hawaiian. And out of that spot grows the first kalo, which is named Haloa. The second born of Wakea and his daughter, Ho'ohoku Kalani is her name. Their second born is also named Haloa. He lives, he's a chief, he becomes the ancestor for all Hawaiians. So in that story, we see that, again, we're all related through Haloa the person, who is the junior sibling, the younger brother of Haloa the Kalo. So, yeah, when I say ancestors, it's catching a lot. It's also catching the islands that we're also related to genealogically through Wakea and Papa. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of work that word does, and that's I think the core of what I think our decolonizing and decolonial educational projects are about.
Hmm.
Is to restore those connections and relationships that stem from the Kumulipo, knowing our ancestors, even if you can't name your specific ancestors. And there's a lot of Hawaiians who can't, and because of histories of disconnection, because of other histories of trauma, and um, but knowing that those ancestors, all of those lands, all those people are your ancestors, and from that is your strength, and from that returning to them
Hmm.
is how we're gonna make it forward.
I have so many more questions for you, but I maybe I'll end on this one because I think what you're saying here and kind of what I've really gathered from this conversation is the importance. I think I wrote down 3 points. The importance of the flow. I think that conversation that you kind of you made that distinction between ditch and between the what can you say the other word?
Away, away. It's
Oh, I
We have this Okina, which is like the glottal stop, but it's actually its own letter. But Okina, Auwai.
Hmm. But the Aoi, I mean, and also what you were kind of speaking about water in the beginning as well, there seems to be this like ever moving, changing flow. And that seems to be something that I felt you had mentioned throughout the conversation. And another one was the connection to the land, to space, and to the people who have come before us and to ancestors and kind of feeling this connection with other people. And I feel like all of this sometimes when you hear people talk about it, and I think it probably is the hardest thing that I've experienced in this season, is that intellectually I can probably understand the words that you're saying. But experientially, when you say any of these words, it's not something I can experience simply just from hearing you say them, because it is something that only by living it and by truly like experiencing it can it become embodied. And that I think is the disconnection between someone who just intellectually understands the experiences of others versus actually embodies that. And so I guess my question for you is when you think about what it means to be indigenous for you, what does it feel like? What is that
Mm,
to the best way
mm.
you could explain it to someone who may not experience that feeling, what would it be like?
I'll introduce yet another Hawaiian word or phrase, aloha aina. So aloha aina is our term for a deep love and loyalty and commitment to the land. Aloha, everyone thinks they know, um, but really the way that it grounds Hawaiians is that this love for the land and the nation and all that sustains us. That's what Aina means. Aina doesn't only mean land, it means anything that feeds us. So it's all of those elements in addition to the land, all the waters, all the environments that make us who we are, that we're related to, right? That because of that relationship, there's a deep aloha that even if you're not naming it, aloha aina is something that is at the core of being Hawaiian. This is what leads all of those hundreds and thousands of people who went to Mauna Kea to prevent the construction of the 30-meter telescope from. This is what led them to show up, right? You can't always put your finger on what it is, but it's there, right? And this is something that's been passed down. Um, it's what has led so many people to show up from Maui and to really not only support the people, but to really fight for that restoration of the water because of that deep love that they have that's passed on over the generations. And it's that same love that we show each other when we see the Aina in each other, when we see the land, when we see the other ancestors, we know. And it's something that we extend to those who are also not indigenous, who are equally committed to this place that they're calling home. And so Aloha Aina is what I would say is at that core.
Hmm. I mean, and it's something that I want to continue to do my best to understand and to experience, hopefully at some point. But I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. This was a lovely conversation. It was felt like a breath of fresh air, and so thank you for sharing all your insights and having this beautiful conversation with me.
Right. Mahalo nui. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.